For most of human history, there were no safe abortions, no modern clinics, and no doctors trained to help women end a pregnancy safely. Yet unwanted pregnancies still happened every single day, and millions of women faced the same difficult problem. So what did they do when no safe options existed? The answer is far stranger than most people realize. Women drank dangerous mixtures, trusted secret healers, followed ancient recipes passed down for generations, and sometimes risked their lives in ways that sound unbelievable today. Some of these methods were hidden for centuries, while others created entire underground networks that operated in secret. And the deeper you look into this story, the more surprising it becomes. Because this is not just the history of abortion, it is the story of how ordinary women, across thousands of years, searched for answers when society offered them none. When most people think about abortion, they imagine a modern debate that appeared sometime during the last century. They picture hospitals, political arguments, court decisions, television interviews, and newspaper headlines. The common belief is that abortion became an important issue only after modern medicine made the procedure safer and more widely available. That sounds reasonable at first, but the real story begins much earlier than most people ever realize. In fact, the deeper historians looked into old records, the more surprising discoveries they found. Long before modern hospitals existed, women were already searching for ways to avoid or end pregnancies. Long before governments argued about laws, ordinary people were dealing with the same problem inside their homes, families, and communities. What many people think is a modern issue was already part of daily life thousands of years ago. One of the biggest surprises came from ancient Egypt. Archaeologists studying medical texts found instructions that discussed pregnancy, fertility, and methods connected to preventing childbirth. These documents were written so long ago that entire kingdoms have risen and disappeared since they were created. Yet the problem described inside them feels familiar even today. Women were trying to manage pregnancies in a world without modern healthcare, and people were already searching for solutions. Similar discoveries appeared in other parts of the ancient world. In ancient Greece, doctors wrote about pregnancy and methods used by women who wanted to avoid having children. In ancient Rome, writers described medicines, plants, and practices connected to reproduction. In parts of Asia, historical records also mentioned attempts to control fertility. The details were different from place to place, but the pattern kept appearing again and again. Women were not waiting for the modern world to solve this problem. They were already trying to solve it themselves. This changes the entire way the story looks. Many people imagine a time when everyone simply accepted whatever happened and followed the rules of their society without question. Historical records tell a different story. People worried about money, family responsibilities, social pressure, inheritance, reputation, and survival. A pregnancy could change the course of a person's life. That was true centuries ago, and it was true thousands of years ago. Because of that reality, people constantly searched for ways to influence the outcome. Some of those methods were based on real medical knowledge. Others were based on guesswork, rumors, and traditions passed from one generation to another. Many were dangerous. Some were deadly. Yet people continued using them because alternatives often did not exist. Another surprise is how openly some ancient societies discussed the subject. Today, many people assume conversations about abortion were always hidden behind closed doors. That was not always the case. Certain medical writers describe reproductive issues in practical terms because they viewed them as part of healthcare. One important figure was Cyrannus of Ephesus, a Greek physician who lived during the Roman Empire. He wrote about women's health and discussed methods connected to preventing or ending pregnancies. Whether modern readers agree with those methods is not the point. The surprising fact is that these discussions were happening nearly 2,000 years ago. This was not a secret topic that suddenly appeared in modern times. It had already become part of medical writing long before most modern countries even existed. The deeper researchers looked, the stranger the story became. Many of the plants recommended throughout history appeared again and again in different regions, separated by huge distances. Sometimes people living hundreds of miles apart used similar ingredients without any direct connection between them. Certain herbs became famous for generations because people believed they could affect pregnancy. Some probably had little effect. Others may have been more powerful than people understood. The problem was that nobody knew exactly how safe these methods were. There were no modern clinical studies. There were no government safety standards. Women often relied on information shared by friends, relatives, midwives, or local healers. Sometimes that information helped. Sometimes it caused terrible harm. Yet the demand for solutions never disappeared. That demand created something even more interesting. Knowledge began traveling quietly through families and communities. A woman might learn something from her mother. A midwife might teach younger women. A healer might pass information to an apprentice. These networks existed long before modern healthcare systems appeared. They were not official institutions, but they often became the only source of advice available. In many places, women trusted these networks more than powerful authorities because those networks dealt directly with everyday problems. The result was a hidden flow of knowledge moving from generation to generation across centuries. What makes this story especially surprising is that every new discovery challenges the popular image of the past. Many people imagine history as simple and predictable. The reality was often messy, complicated, and filled with difficult choices. Women were not passive observers waiting for history to happen around them. They were actively searching for ways to shape their own futures. Some succeeded. Others paid a terrible price for trying, but the effort itself never disappeared. That is why the usual version of this story falls apart once you examine the evidence. The history of abortion did not begin in a modern courtroom or a 20th century hospital. It stretches back through ancient cities, forgotten medical texts, family traditions, and generations of people trying to solve the same problem. And once that reality becomes clear, another question emerges. If women were already searching for these solutions thousands of years ago, what exactly pushed so many people to keep taking those risks generation after generation, even when the consequences could be severe? The reason women kept searching for ways to end pregnancies was not mysterious at all. The real surprise is that many people today underestimate how difficult life could become after a pregnancy in earlier centuries. Modern medicine did not exist. Reliable birth control did not exist. Social support was often limited. A single pregnancy could change the future of an entire family. That reality existed across rich households, poor villages, crowded cities, and remote communities. The problem was not rare. It was part of everyday life. Many people imagine large families as the normal goal throughout history. In reality, many families struggled to feed the children they already had. Every additional child meant more food, more clothing, more care, and more responsibility. For wealthy families, pregnancy could affect inheritance, marriage plans, and property. For poor families, it could mean the difference between survival and disaster. This created pressure that many modern people never have to consider. The decision was often connected to money, health, social status, or simple survival. Women faced risks that are difficult to imagine today. Pregnancy itself could be dangerous. Childbirth could become deadly without warning. In many places, women died during labor at rates that would shock modern audiences. A woman who had already survived several births might fear another pregnancy more than anything else. The danger was real because every childbirth carried risks that doctors could not properly treat. There were no antibiotics. There were no blood banks. There were no emergency surgical teams waiting nearby. A complication that is treatable today could become fatal in a matter of hours. This helps explain why reproductive knowledge became so valuable. It was not simply about avoiding children. It was often about staying alive. One of the most interesting figures in this story was Cyrannus of Ephesus. Living during the Roman Empire, he became one of the most respected physicians of his time. Unlike many writers who focused on politics or war, Cyrannus spent years studying women's health. He wrote detailed descriptions about pregnancy, childbirth, and methods people believed could prevent conception. His work survived for centuries because later generations considered it valuable medical knowledge. What makes his writings so important is that they reveal something many people never expect. Doctors were already discussing these issues nearly 2,000 years ago because their patients were asking for help. The demand already existed. The problem already existed. People were already looking for answers. Another surprising fact is that many ancient methods were connected to plants rather than surgery. People searched forests, fields, gardens, and markets for ingredients believed to affect fertility. Some plants gained almost legendary reputations. Certain herbs appeared repeatedly in records from different regions and different centuries. Nobody fully understood how these substances work. Some may have done very little. Others may have had stronger effects than people realized. The danger was that dosage was largely guesswork. A small amount might do nothing. A larger amount could seriously harm someone. Yet people kept using them because safer options were unavailable. Over time, women often became the keepers of this knowledge. Mothers passed information to daughters. Midwives shared advice with younger women. Local healers learned from older generations. This created informal networks that operated outside official institutions. These networks became important because many women felt more comfortable discussing personal issues with other women who understood their experiences. Knowledge moved quietly through communities, sometimes surviving for hundreds of years. The information changed over time, but the purpose remained similar. People wanted control over something that could dramatically affect their lives. Another factor rarely discussed today was marriage. In many societies, marriage shaped nearly every part of life. A pregnancy outside marriage could bring severe consequences. A woman's reputation could suffer. Marriage opportunities could disappear. Families could face public shame. In some places, legal punishment was possible. These pressures created powerful incentives to hide pregnancies or seek ways to end them. The situation was often unfair because men and women rarely faced equal consequences. Historical records repeatedly show women carrying most of the burden when unexpected pregnancies occurred. This imbalance helped fuel the search for solutions across generations. Economic change made the situation even more complicated. As cities grew larger, people left traditional village life behind. They moved to places where living costs were higher and family support was weaker. Suddenly, many women found themselves responsible for difficult decisions without the help of large extended families. The same pattern appeared again and again. Whenever life became harder, the demand for reproductive control increased. It happened in ancient cities. It happened during economic crises. It happened during periods of rapid social change. The problem never truly disappeared because the conditions creating it never disappeared. One of the strangest parts of this history is how often official rules failed to match reality. Authorities could condemn certain practices, but private decisions continued behind closed doors. Laws might exist on paper while people behaved differently in everyday life. This gap between official rules and personal reality appears throughout history. It became one of the defining features of the entire story. Publicly, certain actions were condemned. Privately, many people still searched for solutions. This created a world where information traveled quietly and often secretly. The result was a constant tension between what society expected and what individuals felt they needed. By this point, something important becomes clear. The story was never simply about medicine. It was also about power, survival, family, health, money, reputation, and personal freedom. Every generation faced the problem in its own way, but the underlying pressures remained surprisingly similar. Women continued searching for answers because the consequences of pregnancy could affect every part of their lives. That reality drove countless decisions across centuries. It also set the stage for a major change that would transform the story completely, because eventually the issue would move beyond private knowledge shared among women and healers. It would collide with religion, law, and powerful institutions that wanted greater control over what people could and could not do. For thousands of years, decisions about pregnancy were mostly handled inside homes, families, and local communities. Women shared knowledge with other women, midwives offered advice, and healers provided remedies that had been passed down for generations. The situation began to change when larger institutions started paying closer attention to private life. Religious leaders, government officials, judges, and doctors slowly became involved in questions that had once been handled much more quietly. This was the moment when the story took a completely different direction. The issue was no longer only about finding a solution to an unwanted pregnancy. It was becoming a question of authority, control, and who had the right to make decisions. During the Middle Ages, many parts of Europe experienced growing influence from religious institutions that shaped everyday life. Marriage, family relationships, childbirth, and personal behavior increasingly became subjects of official concern. Rules were written, sermons were delivered, and moral expectations became more clearly defined. Yet something interesting happened. Even as official restrictions became stronger, evidence suggests that women continued searching for ways to manage pregnancies. The demand never disappeared. The need never disappeared. The risks never disappeared. Instead, the practice often moved further out of public view. This created a strange situation where official teachings and everyday reality often looked very different from each other. One of the most surprising discoveries comes from court records. Historians studying old legal documents found cases involving pregnancies, accusations, family disputes, and reproductive practices. These records reveal that authorities sometimes investigated women suspected of ending pregnancies. They also show something equally important: Such cases appeared often enough to attract attention from judges and officials. That fact alone tells us something significant. People were not dealing with a rare problem. They were dealing with a common reality that repeatedly appeared in legal systems across different regions. The records also reveal another important detail. Many accusations were difficult to prove. Officials often relied on rumors, witnesses, and community gossip. Private decisions remained difficult to monitor. This gap between law and reality would become one of the defining patterns throughout the entire history of abortion. At the center of this hidden world stood the midwife. Today, many people think of midwives simply as women who help deliver babies. In reality, their role was often much larger. Midwives possessed practical knowledge about pregnancy, childbirth, fertility, and women's health. They were trusted figures within communities because they dealt directly with situations that affected families every day. A woman might visit a priest for spiritual advice or a local official for legal matters, but she often turned to a midwife when facing personal concerns about pregnancy. This trust made midwives powerful figures within local communities. It also made them targets when authorities wanted greater control over reproductive practices. Throughout different periods, some midwives faced suspicion because they possessed knowledge that officials could not easily supervise. Another unexpected twist involved medicine itself. As universities began training physicians, a struggle slowly developed between formally educated doctors and traditional healers. Doctors wanted greater authority over healthcare. Local healers wanted to preserve practices that communities had trusted for generations. This conflict affected many areas of medicine, including reproductive health. Some physicians dismissed traditional remedies as unreliable. Others quietly borrowed knowledge that had existed long before universities appeared. The result was a complicated relationship where old and new forms of medicine constantly overlapped. Neither side completely replaced the other. Instead, they competed for trust, influence, and authority. The story became even more complicated during periods of social crisis. Wars, famines, disease outbreaks, and economic hardship placed enormous pressure on families. Whenever survival became more difficult, concerns about pregnancy often became more urgent. Historical records repeatedly show people making difficult decisions during times of instability. This pattern appears again and again across centuries. The harder life became, the more important reproductive control often became. Authorities might issue new rules, but those rules rarely removed the underlying pressures people faced. Economic reality frequently proved stronger than official expectations. Another surprising fact is how different regions handled the issue in different ways. There was never one single rule followed everywhere. Some areas enforced restrictions aggressively. Others paid little attention unless a public scandal occurred. Local customs often mattered as much as official laws. What happened in one town could be completely different from what happened a few hundred miles away. This inconsistency created confusion, but also created opportunities. People learned where rules were strict and where they were more relaxed. Knowledge about these differences traveled through communities just like medical advice traveled through communities. Information itself became a valuable resource. The more authorities tried to regulate reproductive decisions, the more people developed ways to share information privately. By this point, the issue had evolved far beyond individual choices. It now involved religion, law, medicine, reputation, and social order. Every group believed it had an important role in deciding what was right. Religious leaders focused on moral concerns. Governments focused on maintaining authority. Doctors focused on expanding professional influence. Families focused on survival and reputation. Women often found themselves caught in the middle of these competing forces. Their personal decisions became connected to larger struggles that extended far beyond their own lives. The result was a growing conflict that would shape the next several centuries. What began as private knowledge shared within communities was slowly becoming part of a much larger battle over power and control. Yet the most dramatic change had not happened yet, because once cities began expanding and millions of people moved into a new industrial world, the entire situation would grow larger, more visible, and far more difficult for authorities to contain. The Industrial Revolution changed almost everything, and it changed this story as well. For centuries, most people lived in small communities where families knew each other and personal information traveled quickly. Then, millions of people began moving into growing cities filled with factories, workshops, and crowded neighborhoods. Life became faster, more expensive, and far less predictable. A woman who once lived near relatives and trusted community members could suddenly find herself living among strangers. This created new opportunities, but it also created new problems. Unexpected pregnancies still happened, Yet the support systems many people relied on were becoming weaker. At the same time, the cost of raising children was becoming a serious concern for many families. Industrial cities needed workers, but workers often earned very little money. A growing family could quickly become a financial burden. This pressure increased demand for anything that promised reproductive control. For the first time, a large commercial market began forming around that demand. What happened next surprised even many historians. Instead of disappearing under stricter laws and social pressure, reproductive services became a business. Entrepreneurs noticed an opportunity and rushed to fill it. Newspapers began carrying advertisements that sounded harmless at first glance. Many never mentioned pregnancy directly. Instead, they promoted products using phrases like female remedies, monthly regulators, or women's health treatments. To modern readers, these advertisements might seem confusing. To people living at the time, the message was often perfectly clear. Entire industries learned how to communicate without openly saying what they were selling. This created a strange, hidden language understood by customers and sellers alike. One of the most famous people connected to this world was Madame Ristel. Her real name was Anne Lohman, and she became one of the most controversial figures in 19th century America. She built a business providing services connected to contraception and abortion at a time when demand was enormous. Newspapers attacked her constantly. Religious leaders condemned her. Political figures criticized her, yet her business continued growing because thousands of women kept seeking help. Her story revealed something authorities did not want to admit. Public condemnation did not eliminate demand. It simply pushed people toward whoever was willing to provide services. Madame Ristel became wealthy, famous, and deeply controversial because she occupied a space that society publicly rejected but privately relied upon. Her success also inspired others. Soon, countless individuals began selling pills, tonics, powders, and treatments that claimed to solve reproductive problems. Some products probably did very little. Others contained ingredients that could seriously harm customers. There was almost no meaningful oversight. Anyone could make grand promises. Anyone could claim medical expertise. Desperate customers often had no reliable way to separate genuine help from dangerous fraud. This created an environment where misinformation spread rapidly. The market became crowded with people seeking profit from private fears and difficult situations. Newspapers were filled with advertisements offering solutions, but nobody could guarantee those solutions were safe. Another major change occurred inside medicine itself. During the 19th century, doctors worked hard to increase their professional authority. Medical organizations wanted stricter licensing rules and greater control over healthcare. Many physicians argued that reproductive services should only be handled by trained professionals. On the surface, this sounded like a push for safety. In many cases, safety was genuinely part of the argument. However, another conflict was also developing. Doctors were competing against midwives, healers, and informal practitioners who had served communities for generations. The struggle was not only about health, it was also about who controlled medical knowledge and who earned public trust. As doctors gained influence, governments increasingly listened to their recommendations. New laws began appearing in several countries. Restrictions became stronger. Penalties became harsher. Supporters believed these measures would reduce abortions. The results were often more complicated than expected. Demand remained strong because the reasons women sought abortions had not disappeared. Economic hardship still existed. Social pressure still existed. Health concerns still existed. As legal risks increased, many services simply moved further underground. This created an unintended chain reaction. The more difficult legal access became, the more valuable secret networks became. Information started moving quietly through trusted friends, relatives, co-workers, and community contacts. People learned which providers could be trusted and which should be avoided. Reputation became extremely important because official information was often unavailable. In many cities, women relied on personal recommendations rather than public advertisements. Hidden networks began replacing public ones. The story was becoming less visible, but it was not becoming smaller. In fact, it was growing. One of the strangest realities of this period was the gap between public morality and private behavior. Politicians publicly condemned abortion, while reports suggested it remained widespread. Newspapers described scandals involving respected members of society. Wealthy families sometimes obtained services unavailable to poorer women. Public speeches promoted strict values, while private decisions often followed different rules. This contradiction appeared repeatedly across different countries and social classes. The official story and the real story were often very different. By the late 19th century, the issue had become far larger than anything seen before. Expanding cities created larger population. Improved transportation allowed information to travel faster. Growing newspapers spread stories across entire nations. Medicine was becoming more professional. Governments were becoming more involved. The result was a powerful domino effect. Every attempt to solve one problem created another challenge. Every new restriction encouraged new workarounds. Every effort to increase control produced new hidden networks. What began as knowledge shared quietly between individuals had evolved into a complex system involving doctors, lawmakers, businesses, activists, journalists, and ordinary families. The Industrial Revolution did not solve the problem. Instead, it magnified it. The issue became larger, more visible, and more politically charged than ever before. And as the 20th century approached, an entirely new chapter was about to begin, because hidden networks, coded advertisements, and underground providers were only the beginning of a much stranger story. By the middle of the 20th century, something unusual had happened. Governments had passed laws. Doctors had gained more authority. Police investigated illegal providers. Newspapers reported scandals. Yet abortions had not disappeared. Instead, an entire hidden world had formed beneath the surface of everyday life. Most people never saw it directly, but millions of women knew it existed. This underground system operated through whispered conversations, trusted recommendations, handwritten notes, and private introductions. The strange part is that many of these networks functioned almost like secret businesses. Information became the most valuable product of all. Knowing the right person could change everything. Not knowing the right person could lead to disaster. One of the most surprising details from this period involves newspaper advertisements. Even when laws became stricter, coded messages continued appearing in public. Certain phrases became signals understood by people searching for help. Advertisements rarely spoke directly about abortion. Instead, they promised solutions to delayed cycles, women's problems, or private medical concerns. To outsiders, the ads looked ordinary. To many women, they carried a completely different meaning. Entire conversations were taking place in plain sight while remaining invisible to most readers. The hidden language became so common that authorities often recognized it as well. The problem was proving exactly what was being offered. Another strange reality involved travel. In many places, access depended less on money and more on location. A woman living in one city might face strict restrictions, while another woman, a few hundred miles away, could find more options. This created informal travel routes that connected different regions. Friends shared information about doctors. Relatives offered temporary places to stay. Trusted contacts helped arrange appointments. Over time, these networks became surprisingly organized. They operated without official offices, public signs, or legal protection. Yet they often moved information faster than many formal institutions. The more restrictions increased, the more valuable these connections became. At the same time, a dangerous market continued growing. Not everyone offering help could be trusted. Some providers had medical training. Others had none at all. Desperate people sometimes paid large amounts of money to complete strangers. Stories circulated about fraud, unsafe conditions, and broken promises. Some individuals took advantage of fear and secrecy because they knew customers had few alternatives. This created one of the most troubling parts of the entire story. Women often faced enormous risks before any medical procedure even began. The challenge was not only finding help, the challenge was determining whether that help was real. One of the most remarkable chapters emerged in Chicago during the 1960s. A group of women created an organization that eventually became known as the Jane Collective. At first, they were not doctors. They were simply trying to connect women with providers they believed were trustworthy. Demand quickly became overwhelming. More and more women contacted them seeking assistance. The organization grew because there were very few alternatives available. Then something unexpected happened. Members of the group discovered that one of the men performing many procedures was not actually a licensed physician. For most organizations, this revelation would have ended everything immediately. Instead, it pushed the story in a completely different direction. Several women within the collective decided to learn the procedures themselves. They received training, studied techniques, and gradually took on responsibilities that most people would have considered impossible. What happened next sounded almost unbelievable. Ordinary women with no traditional medical careers built one of the most significant underground abortion networks in American history. Thousands of women passed through the system. Fees were often adjusted based on ability to pay. The organization operated largely through trust, secrecy, and word of mouth. Its existence revealed a reality that many officials struggled to accept. Restricting access had not eliminated demand. It had created entirely new systems designed to meet that demand. The Jane Collective was not unique because underground networks existed elsewhere as well. What made it extraordinary was its scale and organization. Another surprising detail involves the women who used these services. Popular stereotypes often portrayed abortion as something associated with a small group of people. Historical records tell a very different story. Women came from different economic backgrounds, different age groups, different religions, and different communities. Many were already mothers. Many were married. Many were making decisions shaped by circumstances outsiders never fully understood. The issue touched far more people than public discussions often acknowledged. This hidden diversity became one of the biggest revelations uncovered by historians studying the period. The underground world also produced countless strange stories that sounded almost fictional. Some providers worked behind legitimate businesses. Some appointments were arranged through coded phone calls. Some women traveled long distances after receiving instructions from people they had never met face to face. Entire support systems existed without official recognition. Participants understood the risks, yet they continued operating because they believed there was a need that was not being met elsewhere. The deeper researchers examined these networks, the more complicated the story became. It was not simply a story about laws. It was a story about adaptation. Every time authorities closed one path, people searched for another. Every new restriction produced new workarounds. Every attempt to eliminate the underground often forced it to become more creative. This pattern repeated itself so consistently that it became one of the defining themes of the entire history. The hidden world survived because the pressures driving people toward it never disappeared. By the late 20th century, the scale of these underground systems had become impossible to ignore. Journalists began investigating them. Activists debated them. Politicians argued about them. Court cases brought private stories into public view. What had once existed largely in whispers was slowly becoming part of a national conversation. And as more information emerged, people started realizing something much larger was happening. The story was no longer only about individual decisions. It was connected to medicine, law, economics, public health, and social change on a massive scale. The true size of that impact would become clear in the next chapter. For most of this story, the focus has been on individuals, small communities, secret networks, and private decisions. But eventually, historians began noticing something much larger. The issue was influencing entire societies in ways that many people never recognized. What looked like a personal decision often produced effects that reached hospitals, courts, governments, schools, workplaces, and public health systems. The deeper researchers examined the subject, the more they realized this was not a story affecting a small number of people. It was a story touching millions of lives across generations. One of the clearest examples appeared inside hospitals. Before safer medical procedures became more available, many hospitals treated women suffering from complications caused by unsafe abortions. Doctors and nurses saw the consequences firsthand. Some patients arrived with serious infections. Others required emergency treatment after attempting dangerous methods. Hospital records from different countries revealed a pattern that repeated itself year after year. Even when governments hoped restrictions would eliminate abortions, hospitals often continued treating women harmed by unsafe procedures. This created a difficult reality for medical professionals. They were dealing with the results, whether politicians wanted to acknowledge the issue or not. Public health officials eventually began paying attention as well. They noticed that reproductive policies could affect far more than individual patients. Changes in access sometimes influenced hospital workloads, healthcare spending, and emergency treatment demands. The issue became connected to broader questions about public health planning. Governments suddenly found themselves facing challenges that extended beyond legal debates. Decisions made in courtrooms could produce consequences inside emergency rooms. This connection surprised many people, because the subject had often been discussed primarily in moral or political terms. The healthcare impact revealed another side of the story. The effects were measurable, practical, and impossible for health systems to ignore. The issue also became deeply connected to economics. Throughout history, economic conditions influenced reproductive decisions in powerful ways. During periods of financial hardship, many families worried about supporting additional children. During economic growth, opportunities sometimes expanded for women seeking education and careers. These changes affected personal choices on a large scale. Researchers studying population trends discovered that reproductive decisions were often linked to employment, income, housing costs, and access to education. The story was becoming much larger than many people imagined. It was tied directly to how societies functioned and how families planned their futures. Another unexpected connection involved education. As more women gained access to schools, colleges, and professional careers, questions about family planning became increasingly important. Opportunities that once seemed impossible were becoming available to larger numbers of women. At the same time, pregnancy could dramatically alter educational and career paths. This created new conversations about independence, opportunity, and personal choice. These discussions were not limited to one country or one culture. Similar debates appeared across different parts of the world as societies changed during the 20th century. The issue continued expanding into new areas of public life. Politics became another major battlefield. By the middle of the 20th century, abortion had become one of the most debated issues in many countries. Elections were influenced by it. Political parties built campaigns around it. Activists organized movements supporting different positions. Court cases attracted national attention. What had once been handled quietly inside families and communities was now appearing on television screens and front pages. The scale of public attention was unlike anything seen in earlier centuries. Yet despite the growing political conflict, one fact remained surprisingly consistent. Women continued facing unexpected pregnancies regardless of changing laws, governments, or political movements. The underlying reality that started the story never disappeared. The issue also crossed national borders in ways many people never expected. Different countries adopted different approaches. Some expanded access, others imposed stricter controls. As a result, people sometimes traveled across borders seeking services unavailable where they lived. This created international networks similar to the local networks seen earlier in the story. Information continued moving through trusted contacts. The technology changed, transportation improved, communication became faster. Yet the basic pattern remained familiar. People adapted to the systems around them and searched for solutions when obstacles appeared. Historians noticed this pattern repeating across continents and decades. One of the most surprising discoveries involved demographics. Public debates often focused on specific groups, but the reality was much broader. Women seeking abortions came from many different backgrounds. They lived in cities and rural areas. They belonged to different religions and political beliefs. They included students, workers, professionals, wives, mothers, and countless others. The issue touched far more people than stereotypes suggested. This diversity helps explain why the debate remained so powerful. Nearly every community contained people whose lives had been affected by it in some way. The scale was impossible to reduce to a single group or simple explanation. By this point, the true size of the story becomes impossible to ignore. What began thousands of years ago as individual attempts to manage pregnancy eventually influenced medicine, law, politics, economics, education, and public health. It shaped institutions that affected entire populations. It sparked movements, legal battles, and policy changes that reached millions of people. The subject remained controversial because it sat at the intersection of so many different parts of life. Every generation inherited the same basic challenge and responded according to its own values, technology, and circumstances. Yet perhaps the most surprising part of all is how familiar the pattern remained. New laws appeared, new technologies emerged, new political arguments dominated headlines. But beneath all those changes, the same human concerns kept returning. Health, family, survival, opportunity, and control over one's future continued driving decisions just as they had centuries earlier. And when viewed across the full sweep of history, that long pattern reveals something remarkable about how people respond when deeply personal realities collide with the rules of society. When this story began, it seemed like a story about abortion. By the end, it becomes clear that it was never only about abortion. It was also a story about how people respond to difficult realities when simple solutions do not exist. Across thousands of years, governments changed, religions changed, medical knowledge changed, and entire civilizations disappeared. Yet one thing remains surprisingly constant. Women continued facing pregnancies they were not prepared for, and they continued searching for ways to deal with that reality. The methods changed dramatically over time. The reasons often remained familiar. Looking back at the earliest chapters, one fact stands out immediately. Women were already searching for answers long before modern medicine appeared. Ancient medical texts discussed fertility, pregnancy, and reproductive control centuries before most modern nations existed. This alone challenges the common belief that abortion is mainly a modern issue. The historical record tells a different story. The problem existed long before modern politics entered the conversation. It existed because human lives have always been complicated. People have always faced difficult choices involving family, health, money, relationships, and survival. Those pressures did not suddenly appear during the 20th century. They have followed humanity throughout recorded history. Another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every time society changed, the issue changed with it. When cities expanded, new pressures emerged. When economies struggled, family decisions became more difficult. When women gained new opportunities through education and employment, reproductive choices became connected to entirely new questions about independence and future plans. The issue adapted to each era because it was closely tied to everyday life. It was never isolated from larger social changes. Instead, it moved alongside them. That is one reason the story remains so persistent across centuries. The people involved changed. The circumstances changed. The underlying challenges often remained remarkably similar. One of the strangest discoveries in this entire history involves the relationship between laws and reality. Throughout different periods, authorities tried many approaches. Some governments imposed strict restrictions, others allowed greater access. Different societies reached different conclusions, yet a recurring pattern appeared again and again. Women did not stop facing unwanted pregnancies simply because rules changed. The problem continued existing regardless of what official policies happened to be in place. As a result, people constantly adapted. When one path closed, another path often appeared. Sometimes that path was safer. Sometimes it was far more dangerous. But adaptation remained a constant feature of the story. The hidden networks discussed earlier provide one of the clearest examples. Across different centuries, people created informal systems to share information and provide assistance. Ancient knowledge passed through families. Midwives supported local communities. Secret contacts connected women to providers. Underground organizations developed when legal options became limited. The forms changed, but the pattern remained recognizable. Human beings consistently searched for practical solutions when facing personal problems. This may be the most surprising lesson in the entire story. Many historical debates focused on laws, institutions, and public arguments. Yet behind all those debates were individual people making decisions about their own lives. Another important theme emerges when examining medical progress. For much of history, pregnancy itself carried significant risks. Childbirth was often dangerous. Medical knowledge was limited. Many of the methods people used were based on tradition rather than scientific understanding. Over time, advances in medicine transformed many aspects of reproductive health care. Procedures became safer. Doctors learned more about pregnancy and women's health. Emergency care improved dramatically. Yet medical progress also revealed how dangerous earlier conditions had often been. Looking back, some historical practices seem shocking because modern audiences understand risks that earlier generations could not fully measure. The contrast highlights how much healthcare has changed over the centuries. The story also reminds us how easily people misunderstand the past. Modern audiences sometimes imagine history as simple. They imagine clear rules, clear beliefs, and predictable behavior. Real history rarely works that way. The past was filled with contradictions. Public values often differed from private actions. Official policies sometimes clashed with everyday realities. People frequently made decisions that do not fit neatly into modern assumptions. The deeper historians looked into records, letters, court cases, and medical documents, the more complicated the picture became. Human behavior proved far more complex than popular myths suggested. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this story is its scale. What began as private decisions inside individual families eventually influenced medicine, law, politics, public health, education, and social movements around the world. Few people discussing the subject today realize how deeply it connects to broader historical changes. The issue touched hospitals, courts, governments, religious institutions, activist organizations, and countless ordinary households. Its impact extended far beyond any single country or generation. The story became part of larger conversations about authority, freedom, responsibility, health, and personal choice. And yet, despite all that complexity, the central pattern remained surprisingly simple. People faced difficult circumstances. They searched for solutions. Society responded. New systems emerged. Then the cycle repeated again. In the end, the most unexpected conclusion is not how much changed over time. The most unexpected conclusion is how much stayed the same. Ancient women searching for herbal remedies, medieval women relying on local knowledge, 19th century women reading coded advertisements, and 20th century women contacting underground networks were separated by hundreds or even thousands of years. Yet they were often responding to the same basic reality. They were trying to gain some control over decisions that could shape the course of their lives. That long chain of human experience stretches across history like a hidden thread, connecting people who never met and never knew each other existed. And once that thread becomes visible, the entire story looks very different from the version most people think they know.